Hi, this is 𝗏𝗵𝗥𝗂𝗺 and you are watching Carnival 24. And in our last interview, we spoke with Richard Seale, the owner and master distiller of 𝗤𝗏 rum in Barbados. Within that video, we discussed how rum is produced, why Caribbean rum needs to be protected, and geographical indication. The export of rum is one of the exports that the Caribbean is known for, a region which many also say is the most tourism-dependent region in the world. But we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into the Caribbean in the area of trade, as it enables countries to obtain the things it doesn't have and to export the things that it does have in order to improve the economy, maintain living standards, and create new opportunities. And as a result, it's extremely important for development and regional integration in many countries in the global south. In addition to this, Brexit, the new African Free Trade Area, and tariff wars between America and China have made trade an increasingly hot topic that governments are paying more attention to. So in order to discuss this, we invited 𝗚𝗍𝗄 𝗥𝘂𝗺, a trade and development consultant based in Barbados and with a great deal of knowledge on regional and international trade in the Caribbean. And in this interview, we asked her to give us a good understanding of regional and international trade, what the Caribbean is currently doing to improve trade and exports, and what we can do to help the Caribbean in this area. So keep watching, remember to like, share and subscribe, and we hope you enjoy the interview. Hi, this is 𝗏𝗵𝗥𝗂𝗺 and you are watching another Carnival Network interview. And today, to help us discuss trade and exports in the Caribbean, we have 𝗚𝗍𝗄 𝗥𝘂𝗺. Now, 𝗚𝗍𝗄 𝗥𝘂𝗺 is a legally trained international trade specialist based in Barbados, and since 2011, she's been a frequent presenter on trade matters at conferences and events at the academic and industry level. Among her many qualifications, she holds a Bachelor's of Science in Political Science, a Master of Science in International Trade Policy, and a Bachelor of Laws from the University of the West Indies. 𝗚𝗍𝗄 𝗥𝘂𝗺 is also the founder of one of the Caribbean's leading blogs on trade, CaribbeanTradeLaw.com, which provides valuable information, news, and updates in the areas of development and trade and exports in the Caribbean region. 𝗚𝗍𝗄 𝗥𝘂𝗺, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, 𝗏𝗵. It is indeed a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Now, in our last interview, we had an interview with Richard Seale, and it really highlighted the fact that there are a lot of things going on that we don't really get to see as Caribbean people living in the West. Inside the Caribbean diaspora, entertainment is usually how many of us keep contact with our culture and our heritage in the Caribbean, but we miss a lot of the important issues because they really aren't covered on mainstream media unless it's something that draws international attention, like a natural upheaval, a hurricane or a volcano. So I'd really like is for people to leave this interview with a knowledge of the issues and opportunities surrounding trade in the Caribbean. But before we begin, to give people an idea of who you are, what you do, and a little bit about your background, can you tell us, what drove you to decide to pursue trade as your focus in the area of education and the route you've chosen in life?
Okay, awesome. Well, as you already said, my name is 𝗚𝗍𝗄 𝗥𝘂𝗺. I'm based here in Barbados. I'm a Barbadian. So I actually got into trade quite accidentally, to be honest. It's not something that I set out from the time I was a child saying, oh my gosh, I want to get into trade. But when I was doing my Bachelor of Science in Political Science, one of the courses that I did was a course called Trade in the Environment. And I loved the course. And when I found out that 𝗬𝗍 actually offered a master's in international trade, I was like, wait a minute, this is something that I would definitely pursue. So that's what I decided to do. And then when I was finished with that, I also went on and did a Canadian diploma called the 𝗏IT Diploma in International Trade as well. So I have both the trade policy background, which is what I would have been taught at 𝗬𝗍, also the actual hands-on trade perspective from the Canadian designation. And I've been a lot of my work has been mainly with the private sector, although now I'm actually in academia and teaching about international trade and finance. But so yeah, I come at trade from different angles, and it's not something that I had planned to get into, but it's definitely a happy space that I found myself in.
Awesome. And again, before we go into our first question and get into the meat and bones of the topic, can you tell us a little bit about your website, Caribbean Trade Law, as well?
Certainly, and thank you so much for the opportunity. I actually founded Caribbean Trade Law back in 2011. Back then, I had realized that there was very little about, certainly back then, there was very little written about trade, and there were only like one or two people who were really writing about trade, and there wasn't really much of a youth perspective being brought to some of these trade issues. And you know, I had sent in some stuff to the media and didn't get it published. I wasn't too sure why, but I realized that you have to be established in order to get your work published in the media. And so I told myself, look, I'm going to be my own publisher, so to speak. So I remember I set up Caribbean Trade Law as my blog, and I started blogging about things with regard to trade, with regard to trade law, with regard to trade policy. And eventually it started getting an audience, as it's, you know, so very prominent people as well started to follow it, which, you know, was very heartening for me as a young person in trade, still a young person in trade. So that's really what got the ball rolling. And I'm happy to say that even though like I don't get a chance to update it as regularly as I would like, it still has a very good following, and people still message me all the time, you know, to ask me about issues about trade and that sort of thing.
Awesome. Okay, so to begin with, I suppose for the people watching this, most of the people are similar to the way I started out before I started to look into some of the other areas and things that are affecting the Caribbean. Many people are laymen, they've got day jobs. A lot of the time they don't have time to look at a lot of the things that are happening in the Caribbean, you know, back home. They're affecting the lives and well-being of our families back home, our relatives, the country as a whole. So would you be able to give like a very brief overview of, you know, just, you know, what an economy is, how it ties in with trade, just like a basic understanding, because trade is one of those things that we don't really look at as people in the diaspora over here, because we don't really get that much information on how it affects the country. So would you be able to give like a brief overview on the economy, you know, why it's important and how trade is heavily tied into the well-being of the country? Just a brief overview.
Okay, well, I'm not an economist, but what I can tell you is that trade is important for the global economy and for economies on the whole. There's no economy in the world that does not engage in cross-border trade. All of our economies engage in cross-border trade. And there's several reasons for this. Our cross-border trade is just basically the exchange of goods or services across national borders. Simple definition. With regard to the importance of trade for our economies, and this applies globally, but also in particularly for the Caribbean, we rely on a lot of the things that we consume by having them imported. So whether it's the clothes that we wear, whether it is the food that we consume, most of it, you know, is imported or it's made with inputs that would have been imported. The technologies that we use, this laptop that I'm using to speak with you, you know, had to be imported. So it's not just goods and services, but it's also technologies that our economies rely on, us as everyday persons rely on from trade. And also the flip side, mainly the exports. So I'm not sure how familiar your audience is with trade. I assume they might not be that familiar, but our biggest export in the Caribbean, as you know, is tourism, which is actually a services export. So, and why is that important? Exports are important for us because, of course, they generate economic activity. So they generate the generation of buying and selling. They create jobs. Those sort of things. They have other spill-offs into the economy because naturally the persons who are employed in these sectors go on to demand services from other sectors, etc. So there's that spillover effect as well. So trade is something that is not unique to us. All countries trade, and I always say, and you know, people in trade will always tell you, it's really not countries that trade, it's firms that trade. But when countries encourage firms to trade, it's because of the benefits for the macro economy that trade will have in terms of, as I said, the foreign exchange generation, the employment creation, the generation of activity, economic activity, etc. So I hope that answers your question.
No, it definitely does. And it really does show how trade affects lots of different areas of things that we encounter in our daily lives, such as the laptop you mentioned. So with the research that we've done and that we've looked into, a lot of trade arrangements, they go through this thing called the WTO. So I was hoping you'd also be able to go through and just let us know and give us some background on what the WTO is, the World Trade Organization, and where did it come from, a little bit maybe about its, its background, its history, and what it does. And then we can perhaps then go into how it affects trade and how it affects the Caribbean.
Okay, awesome. So the WTO is actually the multilateral organization which regulates global trade. Now, a lot of the trade agreements that you're speaking of don't go through the WTO. They are actually agreements that are negotiated. They're technically called regional trade agreements, which are negotiated between countries. And for them to be WTO compatible, they have to, follow certain minimum standards. For instance, in terms of goods trade, they have to liberalize substantially all trade between the countries. But that's just a side. That's just to mention that the trade agreement. So let's give an example. So the agreement that would have been negotiated between the EU and the UK, that didn't have to go through the WTO. That was negotiated between the UK and the EU. It would be reported to the WTO, but it doesn't have to go through the WTO, right? Now, the WTO is, so the WTO is the multilateral organization dealing with world trade, and it actually sets the rules by which trade is conducted internationally cross borders. And when we talk about the WTO, people always think of it as this esoteric, distinct, supranational organization, but really and truly, it is a member-driven organization. So all of our countries in the Caribbean, with the exception of the Bahamas, which is currently in the process of joining the WTO, i.e. in the process of acceding to the WTO, are actually WTO members. And it isn't the WTO like a supranational organization that sets these rules. It's the members themselves that come together and decide on these rules. Now, a lot of these rules were actually decided before the WTO, because the predecessor to the WTO is this thing that was called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And I hope I don't lose your members here. This is going to get a little technical, but as I tell my students all the time, you have to understand what came before in order to understand what comes afterwards. So the GATT was actually formed in 1947. And the idea initially was to have an international trade organization. That was one of the things coming out of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, if I remember correctly, that, there was a need for these institutions. So one institution to deal with the global monetary system, the IMF, the institution to deal with the rebuilding of Europe, which would be the IBRD, which is, we know as the World Bank. And then there was supposed to have been this international trade organization, which actually didn't come off the ground. So there was the GATT, right? The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And there were several rounds of progressive negotiations after that, each round dealing with different areas of negotiation with regard to trade. Initially, it was about reducing tariffs on goods between countries, but then they started to get into other things like, technical barriers to trade and whatnot. And then eventually in 1994, at the end of the Uruguay round, the WTO was formed. So since 1995, it's been the WTO driven by its members. It's 164 members, which is supposed to be the guardian of the multilateral trading system, so to speak. And what does that mean? It means that the WTO sets the rules, the minimum standards for international trade. Countries, if they have trade disputes, can bring the disputes before a WTO panel. And, if they're not happy with it, they could appeal it to, well, that's another story with the appellate body, but, they had that two-tiered system where you could deal with disputes. And also in terms of transparency and predictability in the global trading system. So every couple of years, depending on the size of a country's participation in international trade, their international trade policies are up for review by WTO members. And that helps to bring a level of predictability. So basically, in a nutshell, I know that's a lot, Garvey, but basically in a nutshell, the WTO does several things. It ensures that there's a rule-based system for international trade. If not, it will be the law of the jungle, so to speak. It ensures predictability. So traders would know, because as I said, it's firms which trade. Traders would know, okay, a country shouldn't do X, Y, and Z because it's against WTO rules. 3, it also produces a level of transparency within the system. And 4, it allows for peaceful settlement of disputes between countries. I know it's a mouthful.
No, it's interesting. So one of the things that I picked up on there is that you're, because the way it looks to, well, at least to me and a lot of the people that I know, looking at mainstream media, is that, or the impression that's given is that it's interesting you say, the impression that's given is all trade goes through the WTO. We don't hear about, I don't really hear a lot about the country to country agreements. What comes through the mainstream media a lot of the time is everything that's happening with regard to the WTO, and a lot of it uses jargon that makes a lot of what they're talking about inaccessible. And on top of that, they don't really talk a lot about the Caribbean with regards to trade as well also. So I suppose that one of the questions is if the WTO is put in place to help to calm the waters, I suppose of trade. Last year we had the tariff wars between the United States and China. So it's been put in place to kind of grease the wheels in that regard. What would you say is the main benefit of going through the WTO rather than doing, coming to these agreements country to country? What's the benefits and the drawbacks of both ways of coming to trade agreements between countries? What would you say those benefits and drawbacks are?
Okay, so the WTO, the agreements which are decided at the WTO are multilateral agreements, i.e. that means agreements that all countries benefit from, with the exception of these agreements which are called plurilateral agreements, which are agreements that only some WTO members decide to negotiate. And that's a lot more common now because, that's a long story, but right now, because of the size of the WTO and the fact that the WTO bases the majority of its decision-making on what is called consensus, basically that there's no voice dissent to a decision, and the fact that 2/3 of the WTO's 164 members are actually developing countries and not developed countries, it has been increasingly harder and harder for there to be consensus among WTO members on some major rules. So since the WTO's founding in 1995, there's actually only been one major trade agreement that has been negotiated, and that is the Trade Facilitation Agreement. There have been smaller agreements, but not like major agreements. So that is why you're seeing a lot more countries now doing regional trade agreements, which is the term for these agreements which are like country to country or region to region. And what's the benefit to that? The benefit to that is that it allows countries which want to get greater market access for their firms beyond the market access which is allowed at the which has been negotiated at the multilateral level, was called MFN, Most Favored Nation. It allows those countries to, which are more ambitious, to go and negotiate this access for their members bilaterally. So what you find happening, and I sorry I don't have a chart with me, but in recent years there's been a spike in the number of these regional trade agreements, especially because there's been that gridlock in the negotiation function of the WTO. So a lot of countries are going on their own and doing the thing, and this is pretty much allowed under the WTO. There are rules with which countries looking to negotiate RTAs are supposed to follow, so to speak, like the substantially all trade requirement that I mentioned earlier. But what you're seeing is that this is actually, I think, in many ways, a response to the fact that there's that negotiating dysfunction right now in the WTO.
We hope you enjoyed the first part of our interview with 𝗚𝗍𝐶𝐿 Nichols, and if you want to see the rest of the interview where we talk more about international trade and exports in the Caribbean and why it's so important, then leave a like and a comment telling us hell yeah and more please. And what we'll do is we'll continue to post these videos in 20-minute chunks so that we can get it out there as much as possible. And don't forget, remember to share this video with people who really would be interested and let them know, because we believe people should understand trade and exports and how it affects the Caribbean. This is 𝗏𝗏𝐿, and you have been watching another Carnival 24 interview.